We'll do a review of Likkutei Sichos, Pelik Lamed Daled. This is the Sikha for the Parshas Va'eschanon. In this week's Parsha, it says in the verse that you got to be careful not to forget uh, the Torah, things that you have seen. And we learn from this that there is a prohibition against forgetting Torah. The Rebbe's question centers around the fact that we know that the Rabbi Zera, before he went up to Eretz Yisrael, he fasted 100. We find in the Gemara he fasted 100 fasts so that he would forget the Talmud Bavli, so that it would not interfere with his new study in Yerushalmi when he's going to Eretz Yisrael. And the question is, how was he allowed to forget, and how was he allowed to actively try to forget Torah when there's a prohibition against forgetting Torah? The Rebbe is going to discuss it in various different ways. But ultimately, since the goal and purpose of Rabbi Zera was in order to increase his level of learning Torah, that was not included in the prohibition. The contrary, it was meant to make the study of Torah greater, as we will see in the Seder. We'll look inside. V'eschanon Aleph. Shaninu b'Maseches Ovis, we learn in Tractate Ovis, Kol ha'shecheyach dover echad mimishnose ma'ala olav hakosu ki'ilu mischayev b'nafshi. One who forgets one item, one thing of his learning, the Torah counts it as if he would be guilty with his life because of this forgetting that he's forgotten Torah, even one item. It's as if he's guilty with his life, to pay his life for that. Where do we see this? Shneimar, Rak hishomer lecho ushmer nafshecha me'od. He says, guard yourself, guard your soul. Guard yourself means guard your life. And it says, pen tishkaches advarim asher rou einecha, lest you forget that the things that your eyes have seen. So we see that it's keeping your nefesh, it's guarding your soul, your life. And you have to keep your life by making sure that you don't forget the things that you saw, which is the words of Torah. The Gemara Lamdu, because of that, from this Gemara we learn in the Pirkei Avos, it just tells you that this would be the result, would be a punishment of, is as if you were mischayiv benafshay. That's the result. But in the Gemara, it learns from this pasuk that there is actually a prohibition, a law. The Gemara lomdu because of that. We learn from this pasuk. Shekol hamishacheyach davar echad betalmud over belav. Anyone who forgets one item from his learning will be violating the prohibition of Hishomer Lecho, which is also considered a law. Be careful not to, which is a prohibition. So since we see that there is a prohibition and the seriousness of forgetting learning, so how does this, can we explain what Rabbi Zera did, that he prayed to forget his learning? So we should look into the story that we find in the Gemara about Rabbi Zera. The Gemara tells us about Rabbi Zera. He solik la'ara de Eretz Yisrael, when he went up to the land of Eretz Yisrael. Yosef Meir Tanisa, he sat 100 fast days. The Lishtaka Gemara Bablo Mine, so that he will forget the Babylonian Gemara, the Gemara. Kihecha the loy nitarde, so that it should not disturb him. It should not preoccupy him in his trying, in his derive to learn in Eretz Yisrael. The learning of Babel should not confuse him, not occupy him. The Lechera. But the question we have here, based on the Sichos Ovis and the Gemara, how is it permitted for him to forget the Babylonian Gemara? When we know that anybody who forgets even one thing of his studies, is violating a prohibition. So this is talking about not just one thing, talking about Babylonian Gemaras and Gemara, B'Mekoshke, B'Chulu, B'Chulu. How much more so, and more so, this is called Gemara Babla, to forget the entire Babylonian Gemara, which is a lot more than Dover Echad. If for Dover Echad, you're already violating a law, and here he was forgetting everything that he learned in the Gemara Babla, how could that be? And the Rebbe explains, well, even though the goal of Rav Zeta was that it should not disturb him, his new learning, but still that doesn't seem to be an allowance for that. Let's look inside. The Gemara in the first time of the Rav Zeta, the Gemara explains the reasoning of Rav Zeta. So that it doesn't disturb him. The previous study that he learned from the Babylonian Talmud would disturb him in the new learning, so he wants to forget, so it doesn't disturb him. Shakol kavanosa hoiso, that his whole intent of forgetting was kidei sheyuchal lilmud kidei Talmud Yerushalmi. He should be able to properly learn the Jerusalem Talmud. So maybe that's a reason why it doesn't apply to him the prohibition of forgetting Torah. But the Rebbe says, "Avol l'chayre ein mokum lavir al isurim mefurish." Doesn't seem that there is room, that there is place to violate a very clear prohibition, Sichos HaTorah, bishvil shala'acher, so that later on, Yilma Torah should study Torah, v'ulay yatzliach, maybe he'll be successful. There's no guarantees. Now forgetting the Torah, you for sure, you're violating. But now you're saying, the rest doesn't have space to say that, okay, I'm going to violate now because later on, I'm going to learn better Torah. Just to point out, this would be similar from the idea, we reject if you do a mitzvah that comes through an aveda, can't do such a such a mitzvah. So the mitzvah of learning Torah in Yerushalmi, in Eretz Yisrael, that would be the mitzvah, and therefore he has to violate and forget the Babli here. It's a mitzvah b'av aveda. Seems like a similar situation. And a mitzvah b'av aveda is v'avshi vados. We know for sure that there's a mitzvah. Ubishas ma'aser at the same time. Here, maybe you're not going to be successful. Who knows what's going to happen there? And that's later on. Maybe something's going to happen in between. So how could we say that he should violate immediately a prohibition of forgetting Torah for the benefit that he's going to gain later on, that he's going to learn Torah in Eretz Yisrael, a greater learn of Torah? That seems to be not a good reason. Now, in the Mishnah, when it talks about in Pirkei Avos that forgetting something is so important, you're talking about a person forgets because he forgets, but the prohibition against forgetting is to actually actively not forget, not studying to forgetting, but not if things happen. But in this case, the Rebbe will say he's actually actively trying. Let's look inside. So even though in the Mishnah over there he continues, that he will not be guilty with his life until he will actively sit and remove them from his heart. So this is in the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. The same thing in the Gemara. Well, that is the Gemara Sham. Linyan Alav. The Gemara discusses the prohibition. It says, "Yochel afilu you might think even against his will, he forgot, would also be a prohibition. And be careful lest you remove them from your heart, or they will be removed from your heart. So the pasuk is talking about The pasuk is talking about removing them from your heart, not something which happens by itself. So, but these all excuses don't apply to the case of Rab Zera. Had Rab Zera his spalil, his honor, he prayed and he fasted chulu sheyisirim alibay, so that he can remove it from his heart. So he actually actively removed them from his heart. Uh, so seems to be fitting the prohibition of the Mishnah and the violation of the law from the Gemara. How could Rab Zera do that? Boy, and furthermore, the Rebbe argues, the Pashtus, simply speaking, Kol mei yomim elu sheyosim b'tanisod l'shtakach Gemara bavlo amine. During those 100 days that he was sitting in a tainus to forget the Babylonian Gemara, lo lamad Gemara bavlo, so he must have not learned the Babylonian Gemara, because if he'd be learning it, well, how could he be praying that he should forget it? That would be a matter and the opposite, the praying to forget it and learning it at the same time. That would be a paradox. So he couldn't be learning Babylon. So those days that he's not learning, how do you so that is actually actively removing from his heart because he's not studying, because he couldn't be studying, then he's trying to forget it. So the Rebbe's issue is, how could Reb Zera pray to forget the Talmud Bavli when there is a prohibition in the Gemara, and the Gemara says Mischai Benashi the Mishnah? How could he do that deliberately with knowing that our pasuk in our parsha says that you have to be careful. Pen tishkach hasadvorim mesheroina. In Ois Beis, the Rebbe will bring out that while there's other Rishonim that don't seem to think that just forgetting something from the Torah is a actual lav, and that what the Gemara talks about a lav, it's only an asmachta, and what the Pirkei Avos is talking is about milsa de chasidus, or that righteousness. There's no very clear prohibition to doing this. And mainly it turns out that when the prohibition would apply is when a person is just separating himself from Divrei Torah, and therefore it would not apply to Reb Zera. But the Rebbe brings out from the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, and also based on the Rabbi Yonah and the Bartanura, as well as also Mashma and the Rambam, that there is actually a violation allowed for forgetting any item from the Divrei Torah, and we need to still understand how was Reb Zera allowed to violate this law by fasting and forgetting the entire Talmud Bavli. Let's look inside. Base. In the words of the Rishonim, we find several views. What is the definition of this prohibition of not shomer lecho pen tishkach es advorim asher ro einecha? Aleph, the Rambam ba'id Rishonim they don't mention, they don't count the lav of not to forget in the number of mitzvahs, so that's not counted over there. So evidently, this is not one of the mitzvahs that they consider, and that would be an asmachta, what the Gemara says. And based, on the other hand, the Ramban that counts it, but he's talking about svirale, the lav zeloi koyal shikchas divrei Torah. He holds that this prohibition not to forget isn't talking about forgetting words of Torah, learning of Torah. Elal shikchas maimed har Sinai. This is talking about forgetting the standing the way we were by Har Sinai, because that's the simple meaning in the pasuk. The pasuk says the pasuk says. Al tishkach asadvor mashero einecha that you saw, which was my Har Sinai, and the Ramban says the same thing in the Chumash. Gam b'pirusha la Torah ala pasuk. Also, in his commentary on the Torah, on the pasuk, the Ramban says that we're talking about forgetting Ma'amad Har Sinai. We're not talking about forgetting words of Torah. So the Rambam doesn't count it at all. The Ramban talks about forgetting Ma'amad Har Sinai. What are we going to do with the Gemara? What is the Ramban going to do with the Gemara? The Gemara says Salav and the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. So l'chayra, they have to hold shal yafusa anal shebe Mishnah Gemara. Gemara. Now this that we learn above from this pasuk in our parsha, that the Mishnah and the Gemara says that that is quoted both in the Gemara and in the Pirkei Avos on this pasuk. So they must hold that this limud, when we learn this in the Mishnah Gemara, Habas Machta Ba'almo, it's just leaning on this pasuk, but it doesn't mean that this is what the pasuk actually means. Ve'einoi elo mili de chasidus. So in Pirkei Avos, this would be just matters of righteousness, not to forget any words of Torah, but it wouldn't mean that Rabbi Zera violated a clear isur, a prohibition, because it doesn't really mean that according to the Rambam, and the Ramban doesn't count it at all, the Rambam, and the Ramban says it's talking about something else, forgetting the standing of Torah, that the mind of the Har Sinai, the way we were by Har Sinai. And the Rebbe says further, now there is others that say that it is talking about the Torah, but they're talking not about forgetting an halacha or a learning. They're talking about somebody to remove himself from Torah. But of course, this wasn't Reb Zayda's issue, so maybe this is the reason why Reb Zayda did it. Gam, Gimel. Gam l'das kama memoina ha-mitzvahs v'aposkim. Also, according to the view of many of those who count the mitzvahs and the codifiers, shemonu halav de ben tishkach b'minyan ha-mitzvahs. They did count this lav of ben tishkach in the number of mitzvahs. V'svirlei dekoyi b'shikchas divrei Torah. And they do hold that this is talking about forgetting divrei Torah. But still, they don't learn ha'isuru shepoidesh min ha-Torah. The Isser is not forgetting something, but to separate from the Torah. That is Kilashon HaSmag. That's the Lashon of the Sefer Mitzvahs Gadol. He uses this Lashon. Oy she'ein chayiv ad sheyeshiv yisirim b'liboy. The chayiv is not until you sit and remove them from your heart. Pirush shemefane libo levatola. Meaning that you turn your heart to waste. That's Kilashon HaYirei. That's the language of the Yirei. So we are talking about words of Torah, but you see that it's talking about to either separate yourself of Torah or to turn yourself to waste. So according to this, we can say, it would seem Rab Zera didn't violate any prohibition. The Pshita, because it's obvious, even when he was sitting 100 fast days, so that he should forget the Gemara Bavlo, he wasn't Pirish. He did not separate himself, God forbid, from words of Torah and turning his heart to waste. Of course not. God forbid. While he didn't learn Gemara, Lomad, Mishnah v'chulu, learned the Mishnah v'chulu, loy hifsik lilmod elo Gemara bavlo. Or when he stopped to learn with the Gemara bavlo, so he still does not qualify as violating anything by fasting to forget the Talmud bavlo, not according to the Rambam, not according to the Ramban, and not also according to the day of the Smag and the Hireim, which do hold that it's talking about words of Torah, but we're not talking about just forgetting something of Torah. We're talking about to remove your heart and to waste the time, but that didn't apply to Reb Zera, so he didn't violate anything. But the Rebbe said there's another view that actually it does apply to Divrei Torah and forgetting himself, not just a notion of wasting time or removing from Torah, but just forgetting something of Torah is also a prohibition. We do find another view in the defining of this Isur. Kimuva b'hilchas Talmud Torah the Rabbeinu Hazokin as brought down in the laws of Talmud Torah to the Alter Rebbe. Alter Rebbe writes like this: Shakol ha'shekiach dover echad min mishnasei. Anyone who forgets something from their learning, because they did not review their study as necessary, Maila Olav HaKosuf. So he says clearly, the Alter Rebbe writes, he didn't review his studies properly. The Pasuk counts it for him, Ki'ilu Mischayiv Benafshi, as if he would be guilty for his soul. Begam Oiver also brings down the Gemara, Gam Oiver B'lav Shel Torah. He also violates the prohibition of the Torah. Shenemar, Raki Shomer L'cho. We could be careful not to, that's a violation. Petishkach Esadvarim. So there's a violation. The Shomer is allowed not to forget. And the Alter Rebbe talks about forgetting words of Torah. Where does the Alter Rebbe take this from? But the source for the Alter Rebbe is in the Rabbeinu Yonah and the Bartanura on the Mishnah. So what does this all mean? There is a prohibition, and a very clear prohibition of the Torah, forgetting something of Torah on its own, not just because you're mefana libel of you're just wasting your time, or you're removing yourself from Torah, just forgetting something from the Torah. Loi mishum not because of separating from the words of Torah or wasting. So that's why it's necessary. One needs to review the study properly, continuously, always, not to forget. Kiroi, as fitting, whatever it takes not to forget. So you see that the words of Torah have to be constantly learned so you don't forget them, so you don't violate the law. And the Rebbe says more than just their Bartanura and Rabbeinu Yonah. We can say it's also explained in the laws of Talmud Torah, even though the Rambam doesn't bring it as a lav, as the Rebbe mentioned in the beginning. But in the Hilchos Talmud Torah, the Rambam does say this. Yeshloimar, the Mefurish came the Hilchos Talmud Torah the Rambam, that this is actually very clear in the laws of Talmud Torah of the Rambam. Shekosab, the Rambam writes over there, up to when is a person obligated to learn Torah? Until the day of he dies. Shenemar. Lest they will be removed from your heart all the days of your life, which means there's never a chance. As long as you're alive, you can't have them removed from your heart. You have to continuously remember and can't forget the Torah. That's what the Rambam writes. And the Rambam says further, so whenever you're not going to occupy in Torah, you're going to forget. So you have to learn all the time. Further, the Rambam says, when the person increases in wisdom, knows and not to always learn Torah Shabbat Peh, so then on prepared times, he should read the Torah Shabbat and the words that come by tradition, so that he shouldn't forget even one item in the words of Torah. So you see, the Rambam is very clear about not forgetting anything of the Torah. The Rambam writes, as long as you're not going to occupy, you're going to forget. You're not supposed to forget. So you see, this is what the Alter Rebbe writes, not to forget words of Torah. Why does the Rambam not count it as a prohibition? Why did the Rambam not count this as a prohibition by itself? The mitzvah, because the Rambam's opinion is not because he doesn't think this is allowed, but his opinion, this is part of the general positive mitzvah, the Talmud Torah, kill the Talmud Torah, that the halacha of Talmud Torah, Hilchos, Kivur Bikro Lehej, Bikuntusach Lehej, as very clearly explained in the Hilchos Talmud, in Alter Rebbe, in Hilchos Talmud Torah, Shperi Gimel. There's all in the notes over here, but the bottom line is the Rambam doesn't count it as a separate mitzvah, but that doesn't mean that the Rambam doesn't hold that there is a prohibition against forgetting even an item of the Torah, as the Rambam, the Alter Rebbe writes. So, question becomes, so our question comes back to this place. Since there is opinions, the Rambam, the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Yonah, they say that the prohibition applies for getting words of Torah. How could Reb Zayda fast and pray that he should forget the Divrei Torah? That seems to be going against halacha. So while there's other poskim perhaps don't agree that this is talking about Divrei Torah, but still there's other poskim that say that it does, and looks like the Rambam also, and there's only a reason why the Rambam doesn't count it for other reasons, but there is that issue, one is not allowed to forget anything from the Divrei Torah. So the question we want to know is, how come Rav Zayda was fasting? To forget Divrei Torah. There's Gimel. So the Rebbe is going to try to say maybe what it means to forget the Talmud Bavli that Reb Zayda forgot wasn't talking about the whole Talmud Bavli, which would be part of the prohibition against forgetting Torah. That was the section in which questions and answer. The Rebbe also has a very long, interesting note from the Chedush Agodas Marsha, and the Rebbe challenged but the bottom line is the Rebbe argues that any part of Bavel, it seems like Rav Zayda wanted to forget everything, not only a certain section, and that would definitely be part of the prohibition, would seem, of not forgetting. How could he do that? Let's look inside. Gimel. L'chayre yesh leimar, l'chayre we can say, shalishtakach Gemara Bavlo, that when it says to forget the Gemara Bavlo, it doesn't mean forget all of Gemara Bavlo. That would not qualify as the Alter Rebbe says to forget a din of Din Torah. Elo, rak, b'lshon Rashi, hakushis, upirukim shebetalmud Bavli. This was only talking about, as use the language of Rashi, the questions and answers, the debate that is in Talmud Bavli. You want to forget that part of the Talmud Bavli. Ubazein Isur. So therefore, that part, there is no Isur in the pilpul, the back and forth. That's not what the Isur is talking about. Forgetting is talking about forgetting the conclusions, the halachas in Talmud Bavli, but not the give and take, the shakla v'tarya. And this would be similar derech hamvur b'ilchus Talmud Torah la'admar hazokin b'negei lepilpul b'tayim halachas v'chulu, as it touches the pilpul, the figuring out the different give and take in the rules, the reasoning for the halachas. So what does Alter Rebbe write about it? To say that this is not such importance. That's not something they would review so much. Nami, and for that reason, nishkach kol pilpul hatanoim v'amaroim horishonim. That's why it was forgetting. It was forgotten. The entire give and take from the Tanoim and the Amaroim horishonim lahuvu memenu betalmud ki imat mizer. In the Gemara, in the Talmud, we only bring down a little bit of the discussion of what happened to everything else. They didn't chazes, they didn't remember it. The Alter Rebbe said the rest were forgotten because there is no obligation to recite them. The pilpul was given only to Moshe, basically, which means that they weren't adoring, which means Moshe with the pilpul, but it's not something that we must remember and must chazer. So we're going to say that when he prayed to forget this Talmud Bavli, Reb Zeda, he was talking about these questions and answers, the pilpul. So here we see clearly the people of Torah, there is no Isser. They would forget, they didn't chazer it. It must be it's sufficient just to remember the halachas with the reasoning. You don't need the whole pilpul. ולפי זה מותר לכתחילה לשכוח הפלפול והקושיות והפירוקים. So based on this, even to begin with, you are allowed to forget the pilpul and the questions and the answer. That's okay. So now we have to clarify. I was going to explain this. Is there a mitzvah? Are you fulfilling learning Torah by going through the pilpul? Yes, but the remembrance doesn't apply. What goes on? Kloimer. Even though it is very clear in the laws of Talmud Torah, in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, that in the obligation to know and to remember all of the Torah Shebal Peh, nichlal gam Talmud hamevayir talmi haloch shebishnais. That would include also the Talmud, which explains the reason of the halachas of Mishnais. So, meaning learning the Gemara, which explains the reason of the halachas, is included. Ki im eina yedeya taime ha'halachas, eina meviguf halachas lo ashra aburya. So, if you don't know the reasoning, then you don't know the halacha itself fully. So, we're not talking about reasoning; we're talking about pilpul. You have to remember, but all of the people, that's not necessary. You need to know the reasoning. You can't just chazer the words, because if you don't know the reasoning, then you don't really understand the halacha by fully. So we see clearly then the Lepirush Rashi nechlak haTalmud lebeis chalakim. According to Rashi, the Talmud, the Gemara, as brought down in Kutus Achadir, is divided into two parts. Taime halachas b'li pilpul. We have the reason of the halacha without the give and take. Shekiblu ish mipi ish, they received, person by person gave you the reason for the halachas. That's a tradition. That's not something which is a give and take. And then you have pilpul HaTorah, the pilpul of Torah, which is lahav and davar mitech davar, to understand one thing from another thing. Shelfi zeh yesh leimar. So based on this, we can say Shegam Talmud Bavli Shnei Chalokim Eila. Also in the Talmud Bavli itself, we have this two aspects of it. So just like when we're talking about learning Torah in general, we say there's two areas. There's an area which is reasons of Torah, then there is an area of pilpul. So the same we see in the Gemara itself. In Torah Shabbat Pei itself is the two aspects. Yesh loymar shul v'zeh yesh loymar. So based on this, we can say shagam b'Talmud Bavli shnei chalokim eila. That also in the Talmud Bavli they have these two parts. Aleph hachelik shel talmei ha'halachas b'ktzara. One is the section where you have the reasons of the halacha short. Gives you the reason the halacha is short, what it is. And base, and number two, hakushus va'perukim sheim begeder pilpul. Then you have the questions and the answers, which are pilpul. He only wished to forget that section of the pilpul in the Gemara Babylon, which you're allowed to forget. But he didn't go for the time. The time he wanted to remember. That's not allowed, because that's part of Torah Shabbat the Gemara. But forgetting the pilpul, which we see is not essential, and we see that they didn't chazer it so much, and that's not so essential, so that maybe you wanted to forget that. And maybe that's why he prayed to forget that part of Torah Shabbat. But the Rebbe says that it's mashman the Loshen and the pastors that it applies not to forgetting Divrei Torah means all of Divrei Torah, not just the non-pilpul parts of Torah. Needs to look into if you're possible to answer so. Because besides the fact that Behilchos Talmud Torah Mashma, in the laws of Talmud Torah, it appears Isul Lishkoyach Dover Midivrei Torah Chal Al Kol Talmud Bavli. There is mashma that it applies to the entire Babylonian Talmud. Kushis Upirukim Shebetalmud Bavli ain't no get the moment. When we talk about questions and answer in the Talmud Bavli, this is not defined as just pilpul like that, shemutar l'shkoyach, that you're allowed to forget. That's not the pilpul in the debate is not part of that. Because they are necessary to know the reasons of the halachas in a short way. So we need to know, we need to have them. So besides that, the Gemara we can apply to it. But even if yet, the fact that he prayed to forget the Babylonian from him, Kol Gemara Babylon, that he forgot all of the Babylon Gemara, which was in his days. Not just the section of the questions and the answers that are in the part of the Gemara of the Talmud Bavli. So the Rebbe challenges this assertion, this answer that we're trying to give from both ends. First of all, the Rebbe says the pilpul that we have in Gemara, the Babylonian Gemara, is not included in those matters that you're allowed to forget. That's not included. So that, because this is essential to know the halacha, the way we need to know it. So the Gemara is not part of it. So therefore, from this perspective, you're not allowed to forget it. How could the Rebbe Zayda forget it? And on the other hand, even if you're trying to tell me that there's a section that Rebbe Zayda was allowed to forget, but the Gemara says he prayed to forget all of Talmud Bavli, not only one section. So the question comes back that we still need to understand is, how could Rebbe Zayda pray and then forget Talmud Bavli when there is a prohibition, at least according to the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Yoina, the Rebbe, and then according to the Rambam, the Rebbe brought out against forgetting Divrei Torah. And here he prayed to forget the Divrei Torah. And the Rebbe tried to say that this is talking about the pilpul, it's different. First of all, the pilpul, the Rebbe said, is also the necessary, the pilpul we have in the Gemara. But second of all, it's mashma that he wanted to forget all of it. How could he want to forget all of the Talmud Bavli, whatever was available? He said, Lishkach the Talmud Bavlo. So how could Rebbe Zayda do that? He's Dalit. So the Rebbe now brings in another possible answer that we can answer, because we are all saying, according to the Alter Rebbe, that one needs to know at least the reasons of the halacha b'ktsora in a short way, but at least knowing some of the reasons that you have to know, even though you may not need to know all the pilpul all day around. But the Rebbe brings down from the view of the Rambam holds a person doesn't even need to know any reasoning at all. So Chayre doesn't need to know Gemara, just the Mishnah, just the halacha psuka. So therefore, Rabbi Zayda not learning Gemara did not violate any prohibition, because there's no mitzvah to even know the Gemara at all, not even b'ktsara. But the Rebbe argues there's another issue, that a person needs to split up his time a third in learning Gemara. That's another shalish adam talmudei, 1/3. So while he was fasting and not learning Gemara, how was he able to do that third? Let's look inside. Ois Dalet. Yesh lahoisiv, we can have to ask further to strengthen this question. Is lefum riyat kusha zu al Reb Zayda, in as we run just superficially, this question that we have on Reb Zayda, ein lo mokum lefishitas Rambam, doesn't have any room. We don't have a question according to the view of the Rambam. She'ein chiyuv b'yidiyas talmei ha'aloches afilu lo b'derech ktsara. There is no obligation to know the reasons of the halachas, even not in a abridged way. There is no reason to halachas, the reason for altogether. B'shvil Yidis halachas atzma. In order to know the halachas, we don't need to need the reasoning. We can just know the halachas itself. Ulashitoso, according to the Rambam's view, chiyuv yidiyas Torah shebal peh kulo, the obligation to know all of the oral Torah, and therefore va'isur lishkoyach davar medivrei dinei Torah, and the prohibition to forget any item from the words of the laws of the Torah, koilul rak mishnah. That only includes the Mishnah, the Haina halachas psukas, which are laws that have been ruled, strict laws. There's no reasoning, no debates, nothing. V'loi Talmud, and not Talmud, which is Gemara. V'imkein, and if that is the case, lo'avar Rav Zera al shum isu b'shichos kol Gemara bavlo. So Rav Zera had not violated anything by forgetting all the Babylonian Gemara. So if we take into account, according to the opinion of the Rambam, seems like there's no need b'chlal to know Gemara. But the Rebbe says there's still another issue. There is a clear obligation, according to all opinions, as the Rambam himself says in Halacha Yidalv there, and 1/3 of the time, one is obligated to learn Gemara. So the question is, Bimkein, so how does he learn the Gemara if he's fasting to forget the Gemara? Now, this idea of a third, the obligation to split up into three, the time of learning, that's only in the beginning of the study of a person, but not when he already becomes great in wisdom, and therefore you don't have to do the shlish Gemara then. What happens is when he becomes greater, it's not to take away from the third of Gemara. It's to take away the third of the other areas that you don't need to learn Torah Shabiksav. Not to Tzarich lefanis kol yomav ligemara bilvad. You have to turn yourself entirely just to Gemara. Chutz mi'itim v'zumonim shetzorich, besides given special times, shetzorich likreis Torah shebiksav v'divrei Shmuah, he has to learn the words of the Torah shebiksav and the words that were by tradition, so as not to forget anything from the words of Torah. So, but your basic time spent learning Gemara. So how would Rab Zera learn Gemara? The Imkein Kosher. During those days, that Rab Zera fasted, so he forget the Babylonian Gemara. For sure, he didn't occupy himself in learning the Babylonian Gemara, the Gemara Bavlis. Limud Gemaras, Eretz Yisrael, and he hasn't yet learned the Gemara of Eretz Yisrael. How would Rab Zera fulfill his obligation during these days to learn Gemara? There's no Gemara then over there. So the Rebbe is asking, mainly according to the Rambam, you're saying that there is no mitzvah to learn Gemara of the Indian, not to forget, because there's no, you don't only know, but the shalish, to split your time, you're supposed to split it and learn some Gemara too, at least a third or maybe more. So if he wasn't learning Gemara for those 100 days that he was fasting, he doesn't know yet Talmud Bavli. How could he be without studying Gemara in all this town? So we come back to the question: how could the Reb Zera fast to forget the Talmud Bavli? How is that allowed? Even if there is no lav of leisishkach, or there's no prohibition, but there's even according to the Rambam that you don't need to learn Gemara, but still the shalish the obligation to travel the time to learn some Gemara. How did Rav Zera fulfill it? I say, so the Rebbe now is going to define uh, what forgetting means. Um, this that Reb Zera is not called forgetting. Forgetting means in a way that you are separating, as we learned before from the Rabbeinu Yoina. But the Rebbe first brings in halacha the Alter Rebbe in the Gemara about if a person against his will forgets. And the Gemara says there is no lav. So it seems a little difficult. Anytime when a person against his will, there is no lav. Why do we need a special pasuk over here? And the Rebbe will explain because over here we're trying to say that it's not only that there is no lav, it's not even called forgetting. Because even though normally for an oinus you don't get punished, but it still might be considered violating the lav, but you're not going to get punished for it. But here, the pasuk is telling you that this is not even considered. If it's an oinus, it's not even considered forgetting. So we're seeing that the pasuk is saying forgetting is something which needs to be done in a way that you are doing as the Rabbeinu Yoina said, you're moving your heart, or you're not interested, or but this type of study that Rab Zera did to go ahead and gain a higher level, that's not at all in that category. On the contrary, he's trying to remember. Let's look inside. Hey, so first we're going to divert for a minute to a side track over here. The Yuvan Zeh Bahagdim will understand this by introducing Shebegemara Yesh Limud Meyuchad. In the Gemara, there's a special study. Lidin Zeh for this halacha Shehashekeach Divrei Torah Machmas Einsei Eine Eiver B'Lam. The one who forgets words of Torah because against his will, he will not be violating a law. We can move on Behilchas Talmud Torah, as the Alter Rebbe brings down in laws of Talmud Torah. Rak Hishomer Rak Lemat Machmas Einsei. This is excluding if it's against your will. So the question is, why do we need a pasuk? This is not understood to tell you that if it's against your will, you're not going to be violating. This is a very important, big rule in all of the Torah. If it's against your will, the Torah exempts you. You're not. Why do we need to study and a special exemption? That if you forget the Torah against your will, you're not violating a law. You never, you're never over a law when you do it by inus. As the Rebbe will explain, what we're trying to learn is it's not only that you are not going to get punished for the violation because it was against your will, that Rahmona Patre. Well, we're trying to tell you that it's not even considered violation of a lav. There's no lav over there. So the Rebbe explains. Yeshlem Rabbi Bazel. Say the explanation. And the betam achiv lachzer al limudei kiroi kidei shalei nishkoyach divrei Torah. What is for the reason why is a person have to review his study fittingly, not to forget divrei Torah? Kosav harav al derech ze berabbeinu Yoina. So the Bartanura, which is the source of the Alter Rebbe's and the Rabbeinu Yoina, they say shebetoich shichnosei ubol lahatiras ha'asur, because he forgot the reasoning. He's going to make a mistake and he's going to permit that which is prohibited because he's not going to remember. So it turns out that he's going to be a stumbling. He's going to forget the halacha. So through him, there's going to be a stumbling. Even though it's a mistake, but it'll count as an intentional because you should have studied. That's the way the Rabbeinu Yoina and the Bartanura explained the reasoning why not to forget the Divrei Torah. Avol Admor Hazokin, but the Alter Rebbe, B'Shulchan Lahetik Tamzeh. He did not bring down this reasoning because you're going to forget and you're not going to know the halacha. Afshe posak Admor Hazokin begeder Isur Shichas HaTorah, even though the psak, the ruling of the Alter Rebbe, in defining the prohibition of Torah, it's sourced in Rabbi Yoina and the Bartanura, as said before. So, but the Rebbe, Alter Rebbe doesn't bring their reasoning. So while that's the source, the Alter Rebbe differs a little bit. From this it appears, Shalidas Admar Azokin, in Isur Shikchas Torah, according to the view of the Alter Rebbe, the prohibition of forgetting Torah, it's not rak machmas hatakola. It's not just because of the stumbling. That there will be a stumbling because of it. There is a problem with forgetting itself. How does the Alter Rebbe know this? First, the Rebbe says, how do we see this? So first of all, he doesn't bring down the reasoning because you might stumble. And the Alter Rebbe said there is a problem with forgetting itself. This is also even more evident. The Alter Rebbe writes, the Gam, also now. Now that the oral Torah has been written down, and he can look into the Sforim. That's what he forgot. That is not going to help him that he's going to look it up. Because as soon as you forgot, you are already violating the law of not forgetting before even you looked into it. Hare. So you see very clearly, just forgetting Torah. Miyad immediately, even though it's not going to lead to a stumbling block, because you said you're going to look it up later on. But the forgetting itself, look into the Svarim and know the answer. But still, the forgetting is already a violation. Avilav is a lav. So we see the Alter Rebbe holds, not only because not reviewing, you might come to a stumbling to forget the halacha. It's not connected to the halacha. Just forgetting Torah is already a lav. Because the Alter Rebbe gives you clearly the example later on that even though you're going to look in the Sefer later on, but you already violated the law for forgetting. Now, where does the Alter Rebbe know this part? He paskins like the Bartanura and the Rabbi Yena. Where does he know this part? That it's asur just because you're going to forget the words of Torah, it's a law itself. So he says, the basis is the pasuk itself. Because that there's a prohibition against forgetting is because if the is from the Torah's warning. Torah says Yishomer l'cho goymer and tishkach hasadvori. The Torah said, be careful, don't lest you forget. L'chayra, what is the Torah telling us? Don't forget. The l'chayra, shikha in a pulo. Shikha is not an act. You don't forget. It's not an act. Torah is not telling you to do something. You forget. That's a condition that comes on its own. You forget. How does a person protect himself from forgetting? That comes upon the person by reviewing the learning properly. In that case, if the intent of the Torah, when the Torah says Tishkach, not to forget. The Torah wants you to study so that you don't forget. So you know the mitzvahs, so you know what to do them, like the Bartanur and Rabbeinu Yena. So Adam Yeda v'Yiskidina Torah, Kadesh Lo Tov Takol Al Yodi. Person should know and remember the laws of the Torah, so there's no stumbling block through him. Havalei Lakosu Lahazir b'Signan Asiya. The pasuk should have warned this, using it like do something. because the Torah wants you to learn. But the Torah is saying, no, don't forget. The Torah should have used a language of remembering tzavis al pulos adam, to instruct about the act of the person, the hainu, chazoras divrei Torah, that you should review the words of Torah, kedei shehadam yizker tomid kol dinat Torah, so the person should always remember the Torah. Torah once should have told him you should recite it. And not just to warn him for forgetting. If the intent is to remember the Torah. So therefore, that tells the Alter Rebbe, so what the Torah does tell you, don't forget, or make sure not to forget. So this we learn, just forgetting Torah. That's the Alter Rebbe's source, forgetting Torah. Not because it's going to lead you to not doing, but just forgetting Torah, they writes it in such a way, pentishkach, because that in of itself, gam lule even without the stumbling that is going to come through it, which is the reasoning of the Bartanura and Rabbeinu Yonah, the Alter Rebbe says the pasuk would have said then, you should keep, you should remember, you should recite. So we know who Inyan Torah is Hirolov. We know just forgetting Torah alone is something that Torah warned. So the Rebbe, first of all, learns out over here that the Rebbe learns out that the Alter Rebbe's view is that there is a problem with forgetting Torah itself. Okay, there's a problem with forgetting Torah itself, not just because you're not going to know what to do, but there's a problem with forgetting Torah because the Torah's prohibition is pentishkach, not to forget. And Vav. This explains the Rebbe's question in Eis Hayes, why we need a pasuk to exempt one who's an einus. Because since there is a problem in forgetting itself, just forgetting is a problem by itself. So maybe when a person is an einus, he doesn't get punished for forgetting because he's an einus. But since there's a problem with the einus itself, he's still violating the prohibition. He's an einus, and forgetting itself is an einus. But okay, he's not going to get punished for it. It's patre. But who says that it's not an einus? The pasuk wants to say that it's not only not going to get punished, it's not even an action. The Rebbe wants to bring out if you are doing something, if this is an einus, it's not bichlal. It's not a lav bichlal. So the Rebbe says like this. So now we understand the reason why we have a special need. That one who forgets because of an einus, because it's not deliberate, but the mishappy couldn't help it. He's not going to be allowed. Although an old Torah is Rachmana Patre. So the Rebbe explains, we're trying to say here, it's not just that he's potter, he's not even in the law. Basic fanim protim, we get the Patur Dainus. There's two specific details in the defining why an Einus is potter. Aleph. Number one, even though the act of the Aveda is considered like the person did it. That's one interpretation. So when we say you're an Einus, you did it. You still cannot make him liable for a punishment that's similar to something which was done against his will. Base. And the second way is since it was done against his will, it was forced to it was an oinus lemechshav aveda, so it's not considered an aveda. It's not that it's not going to be punished or going to be guilty for it. It's not about the guilt. It's not even an aveda. What is an aveda? That means an aveda means that you violated the will and the command of Hashem. But when we're saying that's not even an aveda, that's the second way. So he's saying like this: this that we say when you do an act against your will, we don't consider it an aveda. Haverak kishahaveda hi bip'ulo shel isur shenasi shelo ritzona. That's only. It's not considered an aveda. It's only if the aveda is done in an act. You did something, but you didn't want to do it. But it expresses itself by doing something what you shouldn't do. And we're saying that it's done by Einus, it's not considered an Aveda. Avol Shichas Divrei Torah v'Yisura, but forgetting the words of Torah Yisura, Ein ze Isur b'negei le'pe'ula. There is no Isur. It's not the Torah is not telling you not to do something. Elo b'negei le'matzav shel Shikha. We're talking about the forgetting. We just concluded before. According to the forgetting itself is the issue here. It's just forgetting. Forgetting comes by itself from a mela. The person's involvement is to negate this condition by reviewing and constantly learning. But the issue itself is what? Is forgetting. So therefore, it will enter our mind. Even if the forgetting comes because of an earnest against your will, even though he'll be exempt, he would still be violating the lav. This is not something. The second part, when you did something against your will, we don't consider you're doing it. But this is not about doing. This is a condition. So even though it's not your fault that you couldn't change the condition, he would still be violating a lav because he's still forgetting. Forgetting is forgetting. It's not like doing. When could we say that we don't even count you didn't do it if it's something about doing? But here the lav is forgetting, not doing. So even though you are not responsible for it, but it's still considered you forgot the lav. There is no obligation, but still there is a condition of shikha, so you did forget. So maybe in this case we won't be able to say that you didn't do it because it's not about doing it, it's about what the condition, and the condition is here. So while we can't fault you for it, but still it's a transgression. That's if we didn't have the pasuk. And this is the novelty. And when we learn and we're excluding, especially to exclude the mishap or forgetting, ainus of shikha, she'ein kan shikhas haTorah, that this is not considered forgetting the Torah. Torah does not consider this forgetting. Kloima, as to say, ha'odam ha'azhora la'odam, it doesn't rest to begin with. It doesn't apply to the person. And this is the novelty. The Rebbe asked, what is the trying to tell us? It's always potter. But here, there's a special limud and a special exclusion, lemad onis de shikha, to exclude this onis of shikha. She'enkan shikha satoira. That's not called forgetting. Kloimer. Ha'azhora laha'odom al shikchas divrei Torah lo yichalom melechatchila. The warning for a person forgetting what is the Torah definition to begin with, it does not apply elok sha'isa b'ritzoynei if he does it willingly. Avol k'sheu machmas oines, but when it's at a mishap, lo shayich bazet tzivu v'lav klal, doesn't apply to it a command and a prohibition of all. Gam loy lav the Sichos divrei Torah, also not the prohibition of forgetting words of Torah. That's what the Torah excludes. That's why we need an extra pasuk. It's not called forgetting. Aha. So now we have a new definition in what it means to forget. That forget has to be miritzoinoi. But if it's an oinus, then that does not count as forgetting. And the Rebbe says, "V'yumtek," this will be sweetened al bima shekosuv, based on what the Alter Rebbe writes further on. Lahalom bilchus tametorah sham. Al derech al devar, he writes about a person, Mishu bokeitu b'chol limudei hamevil de ma'aseh. He is proficient and he knows very well in all learning that brings him to action. Sheyuchal likvoya loy b'chol yom shok tano lilimud achar, that he can set up a little bit of time, study elsewhere, because normally you have to learn to what to do, and that comes first. But one who knows already, so he can set up some time to learn something else. So what is nochen hadover likvoel? What's the best thing? What should the persons learn? It says lilmud pam achas kiseder kol hatalmud. He should learn one time in order the entire Talmud Bavli v'Yerushalmi chulu umamshich. And then he continues there. He says, he's going to forget everything. He's learning one time, he goes through it once, he's going to forget it all. In the future to come, they will remind him. All that he learned and he forgot because it was against, can't learn, he's learning Bavli Yishalmi, all this information. It's impossible to review so much, not to forget, not to the whole Bible, the whole Yerushalmi. V'gam ato. So in the future, they'll remind him, all the men. And also now, Hashem doesn't forget. You may forget here, but Hashem remembers. It's it's beyond the kisei. So what do we say clearly? If you forget because of an einus, it's not forgetting. Not only that there is no punishment, there's not even the isur, the shichas ha-Torah, of forgetting Torah, because we're telling him to do so. A change that for sure goes back to its original, that's not called a change. When you have to coin something, you have to make an enduring change, a change in order for that acquisition to take place. The change has to be a permanent change. But if it goes back, it's not considered a change. You're not coin it. V'nikne b'ha'adam, and it's acquired by the person. So if the person knew it and then he forgot it, it's going to come back. It's a shinui achoyze libriyose. It's his original. It stays the way and therefore, nishkomenu la'osi lo v'yaskiru, they'll remind him. V'gam ato teros loma shalom ad niskeres l'maylo. Even the Torah that he learns now, above it's remembered before Kvisi Kvedecha. So basically, that is not really forgetting. It's not an Isser. It's not forgetting because it's there, and that is not called forgetting because it's still with the person. Resign. So now the Rebbe explains, "V'had sobaras hadover yesh leimer." To explain this, we can say as follows: Api hanal sheho isur hu etzem hamatzav deshikchas divrei Torah. Based on the above, what the isur is the condition itself of forgetting words of Torah. That's the isur. Yesh leimar, not reciting, but forgetting, not to forget. Yesh leimar shegam ledas ad murazokim. So we can say also, according to the Alter Rebbe's opinion, tam v'geder ha'isur shel shikchas divrei Torah. That what is the reason and what are the gather? What's the define of the isur of forgetting the Torah? Val derech mashekosuv b'smag is similar to what it writes in the smag the Rebbe brought down earlier. Shu mipnei shapoidesh min ha-Torah. He separates himself from Torah. Elo she'eina pirisha min ha-Torah mitzad pulosei. It's not separating from Torah because of an act. Ki'im sheze atzmei shecheach divrei Torah. Because the fact itself that he forgets Torah, not what he's doing, but just forgetting Torah. Even if he's occupied in other words of Torah, that's still considered separating from Torah. These particular words of Torah are separated from him. This is the reason when he forgets because of an einus, because it has no choice. Ein divrei Torah nishkochem imenu. Then the words of Torah are not really forgotten. Kinal Mishulchan Aruch Ad Marazokin, the Alter Rebbe says that he will be remembering it later. The Eibishter remembers it. Kishikchas Torah machmas oines, because when the Torah you forget is because of a mishap, when you have no choice, eina prisho sheloi min ha-Torah, then you're not separating from Torah. Ki sheicheach machmas ointzoi, because that forgetting comes because of an oines. So you're not, it's not your prisha, it's not your separation. Shemitzad ha'odam ein kan klal prisha midivrei Torah. So therefore, there is no you're not separating. L'chein gam mitzad haTorah kenu. That's why also the Torah is like that. Shedivrei Torah shelomet, the words of Torah that you learned, ein bahem shinui. You didn't forget it. Ein bahem shinui hakoine v'nikna. There's no change by the one who acquired, and that was acquired not by the Torah and not by the person. Why? Because it goes back now. Because he'll get it back. So it's not really forgetting. So the Rebbe says the reason why the oinus is not really considered forgetting, because forgetting has to do with his separation. And if he doesn't separate, it's not because of what he does, then it's not called a separation. Yes. So api kol hanal yesh levayer ma'aseh Rab Zera hanal. So based on the all above, we can explain the story of Zera of above. He sat for 100 fast in order to forget the Gemara Bavlo from him. So that it should not disturb him. Since the whole intent of Rab Zera was just so that he can learn the Talmud Yerushalmi as necessary, the Talmud Bavli without the pre disturbances that Talmud Bavli brings, that would not be Perish Min HaTorah. The definition of forgetting means to separate from Torah. This is not Perish Min HaTorah. Adrabah, this is a preparation and gets him ready to a higher level in Torah. And there's more than that even. It's actually going to help him remember things, because the benefit of learning and grasping the Talmud Yerushalmi, it's not just in the style of learning, but it actually is connected to remembering the words of Torah itself. One of the differences between the style of learning in the Bavli and the style of learning in Yerushalmi is Talmud Bavli Nikra b'Mechshakim Yeshivani. Talmud Bavli is called, he placed me in darkness. The study there is like in a dark place. If relative to the Yerushalmi, it's called darkness, Machshakim. Yerushalmi is light. And we know there's no such Torah like the Torah of Eretz Yisrael. Just as actually the difference between the Bavli and Yerushalmi, literally. The Bavli, there is much debate, give and take until you reach a conclusion. Over there's no debate, there's no give and take. Maybe there's a little bit of debate. So that is like somebody who is in a place of light. It's oir. Everything is open. You find as soon what you want, not like in the Babylon where you have to search around. That because of all this, that the much of the give and take makes it difficult to remember. When everything is open and clear. So it turns out learning the Yerushalmi helps the remembrance. It's easier to remember all the details of the matter. So it turns out this that he fasted 100 fasts so he forget the Gemara Bavlo. They shouldn't disturb him. He should be able to learn Talmud Yerushalmi. This caused that the Torah will be guarded in his memory with more force and with more strength. So it was actually helping him with his remembering Torah. Now, Derech Maimer HaGemorah, this would be similar to the saying of the statement of the Gemara, Shuv Lifnei Hadin, that was brought in the Gemara before the halacha, the Kol HaMishakeach Dovarecha Mitalmudei over B'lav, that anybody who forgets something from his learning violates Allah. And this, what came before that, the Gemara says, sometimes wasting Torah is the foundation. Explained elsewhere. The Rebbe explained elsewhere that sometimes the wasting of Torah, that's the pathway to get to the base of the Torah. That the Torah should be based and settled by the person. So it's obvious there's no prohibition of Sichos HaTorah, because Sichos HaTorah means that you separate yourself from the Torah. uh, as the Rebbe says, because this is not separating from Torah. This is to actually further Torah. Uh, the bottom line point is that is not called shikha. As the Rebbe said, uh, there's a pasuk that when there's an oinet, there's not called shikha. Why is that not called shikha? Uh, because shikha means you separate from Torah. If you don't separate from Torah, and in the case of Rabbi Zera, he was actually perpetuating Torah and the memory, so that's not called shikha, and there was no violation over there. Halacha tes. V'yesh levar ba'omek yoser, and we can explain this in deeper. Hatam she'etzem shikchas divrei Torah u'inyan shel isur. Why is forgetting Torah? Just forgetting Torah isur. And as soon as you forget, you violating, even though you're going to learn later on. Because words of Torah are our life and the length of our days. The fact that he forgets and he removes one thing of his learning, so he's removing life from himself, and that's why he's violating a law. So this is your life. If you forget, doesn't matter that you're going to learn later on, but immediately that you forget, you're removing your life and your law. And this also will explain. But of course, this doesn't apply to the Rebbe, as the Rebbe will say. But this is another explanation. This will explain the Torah counts it as if he's guilty with his life. Why is it so serious? That's surprising. He's forgetting one item of Divrei Torah so serious, to the extent that he deserves his soul, be guilty with his soul. So what's this is not a punishment. This is a result from forgetting. If you forget, it's a piece of your life you're forgetting. The words of Torah are the life of your soul. When he is forgotten and was removed from him one item from the words of Torah, so he was removed from himself, was removed the life of his soul from that. Similar to what our sages tell him, what difference does it make? You kill him completely or kill him partially? A part of his life has been taken away. That's considered killing. Why? Because it's chayenu. One area of Torah, that's your level, that's your chayis. It's chayim benafshe. You have other parts of Torah, but it's a kotla palga. And malikotla palga, malikotla kula. But that's only if you forget it. Move on, come and get it. The Mekibon Shekol, understand by Reb Zedo. The Mekibon Shekol Kavanos Bitanisei. Tanisei Elu, Tanisov, Tanisei Elu. In these fasts, so that he can understand properly the Talmud Yerushalmi. So there is no separation, God forbid. He didn't separate from the ways of Torah. Still connected. Kim Adrab, on the contrary, Zu Hoisa Derech, that was the pathway, Sheyuchol, Lilmed Ulasachad Torah, that he can learn and unite with the Torah by Fanayla Yos on a higher level, in a way of light. Now, of course, this is a very, very detailed, and we have to go through the Sichos to see how each of these points in each of these are connected, how one leads to the other, because we learned about, the question was obvious, how Reb Zeder was allowed to do it. The answer is also obvious, or Rebbe explained, that this is not called forgetting, but the Rebbe got to there by first bringing down the question of why do we need a pasuk for shechech, that it is not that if it's an oinus, and the Rebbe says we would think that forgetting is different than everything else because it's not an act. So now we know forgetting is, and then we know, and we're saying that there's not even a lav. So we know, so it's about forgetting. So it's Peidish, it's separating from Torah. That's where the key lies. Now, again, this is good for a first time, going to be done over again. This is Mesichas Shabbos Parshas Trumo, Shabbos Parshas Vayakov Pekudei, Tovshin Mem.